So I want to start today from page Shin Samech Bet, which you got last week. I added a couple of pages to after Shin Samech Bet. I added today Shin Samech Daled, Shin Samech Gimel, and Shin Samech Daled. But I want to start from Shin Samech Beis. Okay. So take a look at Shin Samech Beis, because I promised you that this week we're going to see that Reb Yaakov speaks about the Abarbanel on that pasuk Lefanim Israel, which Reb Yaakov said was written in Lechora. The question was, it's written by Shmuel. It's only a year and a half in between. So why Lefanim Israel? Lefanim Israel sounds like 100 years ago, right? So Reb Yaakov, when I spoke to Reb Yaakov about it, all he said to me was, what the Abarbanel said is, he said, I'll never forget, he says, he's saying contrary to a Gemara. Right? That's all he said to me. But it seems when he gave a shir in the Brisker Kollel in Muncie, okay, he spoke about this at greater length, this Abarbanel. So let's see what the Abarbanel writes for the problem of how could it be that Shmuel wrote Lefanim Israel, right? It used to be called a Roa, now it's called a Navi when it's only a year and a half ago. Okay? So on Shin Samech Beis, the new paragraph on the right side, it says, Umasha Kosav Kana Abarbanel. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Okay. Shono, he brings the Lashon. Va'pasik hazeh mora shlo Kosav zeh Shmuel. This pasuk teaches us that Shmuel didn't write it. He didn't write this pasuk. Ki im Yirmiyahu o Navi acher shekam acharav yom rabim. Either Yirmiyahu added it, or another Navi that he doesn't name that was, that lived years later. V'lazeh siper minag hashemus b'yamim harishonim u'minhagam bizman shenichtar hasefer. And in this he told this Navi, whoever he was, Yirmiyahu, who lived at the end of the first temple period, if he wrote this, he told what the minhag of the names in those days were, and then the minhag bisman shenichtav hasefer. In other words, when Yirmiyahu wrote the sefer, let's say, it was about 450 years, 500 years after Sefer Shmuel happened, right? So when he added this to Sefer Shmuel, to say that maybe you don't know what a roa is, but 500 years ago, a Navi was called a roa. Oh, Nosaf HaPasuk Hazeh Miyad Ezra. Or maybe Ezra put it in, because why did he say Ezra? Because Ezra was part of Anshe Knesset Gedola. And they did edit Svarim. That the Gemara says in Baba Batra that Anshe Knesset Gedola did do some editing, like Yecheskel, if I'm not mistaken, the Anshe Knesset Gedola wrote, because Yecheskel was in Chutz La'aretz, so he didn't have the proper nevuah for it, so they wrote it, the Anshe Knesset Gedola, which Ezra was part of. U'kamoshe Vesi Bagdamas HaSvarim Ha'ela, Barosh Sefer Yoshua. Like the Abarbanel says that I brought in my introduction to these Svarim, meaning Nevi'im Rishonim, at the beginning of Sefer Yoshua. I didn't look up what he says there, but he seems to say over here that he, in his Hagdama to Sefer Yoshua, the Abarbanel writes Hagdamas to Svarim. So in Hagdama to Sefer Yoshua, he says, I brought, different opinions about, who wrote what. Zeu neged Chazal. This goes against Chazal. What the Abarbanel will say. Sheshmuel Kosav Sifro, v'God HaChozeh, v'Nosan HaNavi Gomro. And God HaChozeh, God was called God HaChozeh. He was a Navi after Shmuel, but probably before Nosan or overlapped with Nosan Hanavi, right? God HaChozeh, Nosan Hanavi Gomro. The Gemara says, Gemara, they finished the Sefer. Why do they say it? Because obviously Shmuel died in the middle of Sefer Shmuel. So somebody had to finish it, right? Shmuel dies at the end of Shmuel Aleph. I'm using Shmuel Aleph only to understand where it is, right? Because Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Beis are Goyim wrote that, right? It's not Jewish, right? But the end of Shmuel Aleph, Shmuel dies, right? Even before the end of Shmuel Aleph, he dies, right? And then Shaul dies. Of course, he gets killed. Him and Yonasan get killed in a war, right? So, the Gemara says that Nassan and God finished it. Okay, maybe they had a Kabbalah like that. Maybe they're saying it Misvara. The Gemara doesn't say. Rashi doesn't really say how they knew it, but that's what the Gemara says. V'lo amru Chazal shows sifu bo od neviim acharkach, and Chazal don't say that any other neviim got involved over here. According to the Abarbanel, it should say in the Gemara, and Yirmiyahu did a couple of notes here and there, or Ezra did a couple of notes here and there. It doesn't say it in Chazal. So that's what Reb Yaakov told to me, Baal Peh. He dismissed the Abarbanel because it's contrary to the Gemara in Baba Batra. Okay, now, again, one could kvetch and say, wait, it's only one pasuk he added. So maybe the Chazal didn't say that, there was a one pasuk addition from another Navi. You could kvetch that, but Reb Yaakov didn't accept it. Now, from here on, something really interesting happens, okay? Where he has an extra problem with this Abarbanel that almost has nothing to do with the Indian here, but has a broader connotation of, wait a minute, can you say contrary to Chazal about who wrote Svarim? Right? So he says like this, V'divrei Abarbanel heim le'even negef u'litzor michshol. And the words of the Abarbanel are a stone plague, and Evan is a stone plague, meaning a plaguing stone, and a tzur michshol is a stumbling. Give me another word for stone. Tzur is also a tzur Yisrael.
Well, they both mean stumbling blocks.
Right. That's what the pasuk means in Yeshaya. The stumbling blocks. He says this Abarbanel was a stumbling block. And now look what he says. She'echav katavli et varav. Someone wrote me the Abarbanel's words. Ve'sik mitocham. And the fellow who wrote me, which is nameless over here, right? The fellow who wrote me decided from the Abarbanel shemut lachlok al kabbalas chazal imzela regela pirush taryag mitzvahs lamaisa. It's mutter to argue on Chazal if it's not relevant to the Taryag mitzvahs lamaisa. And this, of course, is not negayat to Taryag mitzvahs, because who wrote what is not one of, it's not a kiyum mitzvah. It's just history, really. And the same person wrote me about the Ramban, but Maimra vikuach shelo. If you all know the famous Ramban's vikuach, right, with Kristen Pavliano, right? And in there, right, he called it vikuach or milchemes Hashem, ot chaf ot lamed tes, shekasav ezel lashona. Yesh lanu shlosha minim svarim. The Ramban is reacting to a question Pavlo Cristiano asked him, right? That he was a Jew, but he converted to Catholicism, right? And he asked him, he said, there's a medrash that says, Reb Yaakov doesn't exactly bring the medrash here, so I'm going to bring it for you. It's a famous medrash that the Pavlo Cristiano said, there's a medrash that says on the day the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, Mashiach was born. That means Mashiach is here already. So what are you guys saying he's not? Mashiach is here, and Jesus is his name, right? So parenthetically, I'll tell you that the Ramban says, by the way, your question on me is a proof against you. Why? Because you know that Mashiach was, that Jesus was born 200 years before the destruction of the temple. right? So if it says Mashiach was born the day the temple was destroyed, the base of Israel was destroyed, so Jesus can't be Mashiach anymore because it's not. Jesus was born 200 years before. That's the Ramban in parentheses. He says, but he says, I want you to know there's 3 svarim we have. 3 minim shel svarim, types of svarim. Echad hu hababali. It sounds like the Bavli, right? But it means the Bible, right? HaTanach. V'kulanu ma'aminim bo emuna shleima. We all believe in the Tanach. V'asheni hu nikra Talmud. And the second book is called Talmud. V'hu pirish l'mitzvah Torah. And the Talmud is a pirish for the mitzvah Torah. This is the lashon of the Ramban. Ki b'Torah yesh taryag mitzvos. Ve'en ba'acha shelo nisparsha b'Talmud. There's 613 mitzvahs, and there's not one that is not explained in the Talmud. Okay? There are some mitzvahs that might not be explained in the Mishnah, but not in the Talmud. Okay? The Talmud, all the mitzvahs are covered. We believe that they had the correct explanation. The Talmud had the correct explanation of the mitzvahs. Sefer Shlishi. We have a third type of sefer, a nikra midrash. It's called the midrash. Okay, you have Tanach, Talmud, and midrash. Rotzalomar, sermonish, sermons, sermons. Sermons, he calls it. In Spanish, he calls it sermons for the guy. Kamoshim yamana hegmon. If a leader, really hegmon here probably means like a cardinal or a bishop, because he was talking to the higher echelons of Catholicism, right? But a hegmon in the Talmud could also mean a governor. But yasa sermon, and he'll make a sermon means a ceremony, not a ceremony, but a sermon. He makes a sermon, right? And one of the people listening to the bishop's sermon decided he liked it, and he wrote it down. V'zeh sefer misha yamin bo tov, u'misha lo yamin bo lo yazik. And this category called the medrash, one who believes in it, it's okay to believe in it. But if you don't believe in it, lo yazik, it doesn't hurt. Meaning you're not considered an apikoris, and doesn't ruin your ruchnius in some shape, right? That's what the Ramban says, ad kal lashona. Okay? This is a very controversial Ramban. Because the Ramban, if you take him at his word, what he's saying is, you don't have to believe that the medrash is true. Okay? Now, by the way, the Ramban here doesn't really clarify, because I would have said, you don't have to take it kipshuto that Mashiach was born on the day that the base of Israel was destroyed, right? You don't have to take it kipshuto. You can learn it as an allegory to something, a deeper pshat in, what that the day of the destruction was really the new beginning, or something like that. You know what I mean? I'm not going to go into now. We could say a whole share on it, but just superficially, right? But the Ramban doesn't say that here, even though there's another place before where the Ramban is first questioned about this. He does say, I don't believe it, or there's a deeper pshat. I think he uses the word pshat nistar, I think he says. But here he doesn't say that, right? He just says, you don't have to believe it. There he also says he doesn't believe it, right? And the question is, did the Ramban say this in order to bidocha the Catholics? But of course, he doesn't believe that you don't have to believe in Medrash. Or does he actually believe this, right? And this is a very controversial idea. If you want to see a big discussion about it, look in Rabbi Chevel's Kitvei HaRamban, where he, of course, publishes this Ramban's Vikuach, right? And in there, he has the different opinions about this amongst Gedolei Torah, okay? Some say that the Ramban really meant it, and you don't have to believe that the Medrash, you're not an apikoros if you don't believe in the Medrash. And others said chas v'sholom. But we'll see Reb Yaakov's approach to this in a moment, right? And I'll be able to tell you why Reb Yaakov's approach the way it is, right? Obviously, the Frumer approach is to say that the Ramban was just talking to the Goyim, and he needed to push them away and get rid of the question they had. And that's what he said to them. You don't have to believe in it. If I'm not mistaken, Pavlov Christianity called him an apikoros. Because you imagine he's Catholic and he called him an apikoros. Okay. Okay. Vakosif Kosavli, and the one who wrote me, Reb Yaakov says, he wrote me, Shehine Ramban Sovish Divrei Chazal in Chayavim. You see that the Ramban also held that there's words in Chazal that are not relevant to halacha, right? You're not obligated to believe in those. So he says you have the Abarbanel that disagrees with Chazal in Masechet Baba Basra, and you have also the Ramban, right? By the way, we could differentiate because the Gemara in Baba Basra, right, is a historical Gemara. It's telling you what the Svarim are and who wrote them, right? That's the Gemara in Baba Basra in the first parak, right? What the Svarim are, Yoshua, Shoftim, Shmuel, Malachim, right? For instance, they have different names that we don't have. Like we call Sefer Eicha Eicha. In the Gemara, it's called Kinos, right? But since we have a Kinos today, we don't call it Kinos, so you'll get mixed up between the two Kinos, so we call it Eicha, right? But there are other Svarim, right? That Ezra is only Ezra, there's no Ezra Nehemiah, right? So Chazal gave us the names, and they gave us who wrote it, who the authors were, and maybe some of the authors like Yecheskel didn't write his Sefer. Anshe Knesset Agdola wrote it down, okay? So this is what so you could differentiate and say, well, in Chazal, in a Medrash, I could reinterpret a Medrash. But there, the Abarbanel's arguing on a Gemara. There's no two ways about it, So the fellow who's writing to Reb Yaakov is saying, you see, you could argue on a Gemara because it's not relevant to halacha. So he says like this, Va'od kosavli, shechasam sofer b'shayel zechuvas arachaim simin tesvav, tezayin. Obviously, this guy who was writing is a Talmud Chacham. He quoted a Chuvas Chasam Sofer. Hevi Divrei Ramban Elu. He brings this Ramban that that it's okay. The Ramban is okay. The Chasam Sofer himself brings the Ramban. Okay, I checked it. It's there, and Reb Yaakov's going to have a comment about it. Now, the fellow who Reb Yaakov Kamenetsky brought the whole tshuva here. I'm not going to go through the whole tshuva because it's really not relevant, the tshuva, okay? But we'll go through the part that's relevant in the tshuva. Just the end of the tshuva is relevant, where he quotes the Ramban. V'anisilo, I answered him, sheborali k'shemish Ramban omakach b'vikucho, b'vikuchayo, I guess, imanotzrim, because he knew that they're not going to accept the nister ideas that the Medrash is really telling us. So that's why he didn't try to give them an answer. They're all true, right? Now, that doesn't mean that Reb Yaakov holds they're all true and should be understood kipshuto. That's not what Reb Yaakov is saying. He's saying that they have a message to say, and you have to believe in that message. That message is Chazal. You have to believe the Medrash. The Medrash meaning the message that they're giving you. But we can decide maybe it's giving Medrash X, Medrash Y, but whatever Medrash we decide, whatever meaning we decide, maybe you have to believe it. And you can't say, I don't believe in this, even though the Ramban said, I don't believe it. But he didn't mean that. He just was saying it and Reb Yaakov says, Borali kashemesh. It's clear to me like the sun that's the Ramban. Harei ron ketzat b'pirusha ala chumash Ramban mashkune nafshe al divrei zal. Very interesting expression. Behold, we see on Chumash, in his commentary on Chumash, the Ramban mashkune nafshe al divreim. The Ramban says he pawns his soul on their, this is literal translation. He pawns mashkon, his soul on their words. What does that mean? He goes to lengths to show that Chazal are correct in his Pirush on Chumash. I'll give you one example. The Ibn Ezra says that he wonders about whether Avram Avinu was ever thrown into a Kivshan Ha'esh. Why does he wonder? He says, it's a pretty good miracle. You think the Torah wouldn't tell you? Why wouldn't the Torah tell you a miracle like that? So he has questions whether he believes that it really happened. That's a medrash, right? That Nimrod took Avram Avinu, threw him into Kivshan Ha'esh in this week's parsha, almost, right? Around this week's parsha, right? So the Ramban says, I'll prove to you, to the Ibn Ezra. He first takes a swipe at the Ibn Ezra, gives him a punch, and then he says, I'll show you that it's true, and he tries to prove from a pasuk that it happened. Okay? But the point of Reb Yaakov is that you see the Ramban tries to protect Chazal, right? So you see, that's the way it was. By the way, there's a place where Reb Yaakov writes that the Ramban always try to protect the earlier periods, okay? We know that. The Ramban attacks the Rambam in his Sefer HaMitzvos, right? That's the Ramban attacking the Rambam. Why? And he writes, because the Rambam attacked the halachas gedolos. He says, I'm going to disagree with him on the counting of mitzvos, right? The Ramban attacks the Baal HaMor. Why does he attack the Baal HaMor? He writes, because he's attacking the Rif, right? And the Ramban held that the halachas gedolos and the Rif were gaonim, and you can't attack them. So Rabbi Yaakov writes about this, that the Ramban was, just like Rabbi Yaakov said, he says, the Ramban held from my cloud. That's why anytime you try to attack someone from the Gaonic period, the Ramban's there to protect them. And that's what the Ramban did with Chazal as well. Kal v'chomer. He's going to protect Chazal. If Ibn Ezra says, Chazal, sometimes the Ramban will say, this is the Chazal, and al pi pshat, you could say like this. He's not arguing that the Chazal are not pshat. Don't get me wrong. He's not yeshivish. Could be like in the Mir Yeshiva, they hold that the Ramban is pshat. I mean that the Chazal are pshat, or Rashi's pshat. Rashi is not pshat. Rashi says clearly, I'm not pshat. I'm the drash closest to pshat. But for some reason, it got mixed up in the yeshiva world, and now Chazal became the pshat, right? But I'll show you that Reb Yaakov didn't hold that way, okay? We'll show you in two different pieces. Okay, so that's what the Rabbi Yaakov says. Okay, Umasha Kosovli, and this that he wrote to me, Listayeya me'achsam sofer, iyanti sham v'risi shlo kosov kain kosov. I looked in the tshuva, right, and I saw he doesn't write that. What the fellow tells me he writes. He does quote the Ramban, but he doesn't quote the Ramban the way the fellow makes it out to be. Okay, so now skip to page Shin Samach Dalet that I gave you today, okay? Because the rest of the page is all the very interesting tshuva of the Chassam Sofer, very interesting tshuva. He talks about Chasidus there, the Chassam Sofer, and he says he doesn't understand certain things about Chasidus. We're not going to go into it right now, but at the end, he quotes, let's take Shin Samach Dalet, the right-hand column, 1, 2, 3, 4 lines from the top, and it starts Ukvar Kosav Ramban. Okay, you see that? Ukvar Kosav Ramban, Besifro Milchomas Chova. This is the Chassam Sofer quoting the Ramban. This is his lashon. Ukvar Kosav Ramban Besifro Milchemas Chova. Kol Mashalo Nimtzu B'Shas Bavli V'Yerushalmi Umedrasheim Ein Adam Mechuyev Lamino V'Amamin Yamin Ad Kalashon Chassam Sofer. What did Chassam Sofer say? That the Ramban wrote in his Vikuach B'Chomas Chova, anything that's not found in the Shas Bavli Yerushalmi Umedrashehem, Ein Adam Mechuyev Lamino V'Amamin Yamin. That's the way he quotes the Ramban. Okay? He's not obligated, but if he wants to believe, he can believe. Ad Kalashon Chassam Sofer. He doesn't quote the Ramban verbatim. He probably didn't have it in front of him. Probably knew it by pen. He quoted him basically. Hine yiches Chassam Sofer Ramban she'ada Rabba mashlo nimtza b'shas umedrashim ein tzarich la'amin. If it's not in Shas and Medrashim, he writes, you don't have to believe. Ulam masha nimtza b'shas umedrashim tzarich la'amin. The way the Chassam Sofer is quoting the Ramban, he includes Medrash in something you have to believe in, because he says in Medrashim. Now, I will learn the Chassam Sofer meaning Medrash Halacha, right? That's the way I would learn the Chassam Sofer, not Medrash Agoda. But Reb Yaakov understood it, Medrash Agoda, and therefore Reb Yaakov asks on the Chassam Sofer, Ela Tzorachin, Gufa, Shevesi Lo Kosavke. But it's a Tzorachin, Shabaramban, Gufa, Shevesi, the Ramban I brought. Lo Kasavke, he doesn't write like the Chassam Sofer, and the Chassam Sofer says he's quoting the Ramban. He's quoting the Ramban, so it's a little bit strange. But I would have learned that the Chassam Sofer means Medrash Halacha, and Medrash Haggadah you don't have to believe. That's the way he understood the Ramban, and it is a little bit of a riot to the guy who's writing him. But Reb Yaakov knocks him off completely and says Chas v'Shalom, and that the Abarbanel is saying against Chazal. And therefore, you can't be somach on the Abarbanel, basically. But he says that you see how people took the Abarbanel and used it now for a much broader context to say that I don't have to believe in Chazal, right? Which he felt is very dangerous, right? In any event, there are people that do learn the Ramban. I mean, Gedolei Achronim, that learn the Ramban really meant that if you don't believe in a Medrash, right? It's not, you're not an apikoros, right? The way I always understood the Ramban was you don't believe that a Medrash is kipshuta. You're not an apikoros. You have to believe it's kipshuta, right? So I had actually a story once. I'll tell you the story, a short story. I was in Seattle, Washington, recruiting students, and they asked me to give a share for the women in Seattle. There's a kollel in Seattle, Washington. They asked me to give a share for the women in Seattle. Now, the women in Seattle are all different types. I don't know if Michael ever went to Seattle, Washington, right? Didn't go, right? So in Seattle, Washington, it's a community. I forget the name of the community. They have an Ashkenazi community and a Sephardi community. And the Ashkenazi community, I think it may be called Seward Park. I don't remember. Maybe it's called that. And I gave a share. There were all types of women there. Women with head coverings, women without head coverings, women in skirts, women in pants. And I gave the share. And the Rosh Kollel's wife was there. Okay. And I was speaking. It was the day of Tu B'Shvat. So I spoke about the trees that Yaakov brought to Mitzrayim. The Medrash says, right? He took the trees, Va'ita Eshel Beersheva, and he brought them to Mitzrayim, and those were the trees they used to make the Mishkan, right? And I spoke about why they used those trees to make the Mishkan. Why did they dafka use those trees? Okay? So one of the women asks me and says, Rabbi Shurin, do you really believe that Yaakov brought those trees to Egypt? And they brought the trees out of Egypt like a few hundred years later, and they made the Mishkan out of that? Do you really believe that? So I said it's an interesting question whether you have to take Chazal like at face value, or it's not exactly, it's not really the truth that's what they did, but there's a message here about those trees coming into Egypt and going out of Egypt, right? There's a message. It doesn't have to be historically correct. But I don't want to get into that now because that needs a whole share, if not a whole month, to talk about it. That's what I told the woman. Afterwards, the Rosh Kollel's wife comes over to me and says, how could you say such a thing? Why didn't you tell her that you have to understand Chazal Kipshuto? That he took the trees out and he brought them to Egypt, and he took them out of Egypt, and they built the Mishkan from that. So I said, are you positive that you have to take Chazal literally? Are you positive? He says, of course. She says to me, if you don't think so, I have problems with it. Can I send students to your school? So I said to her, you don't have problems with me. You have problems with this. I thought of on the spot. You don't have problems with me. You have problems with the Maralmi Prague. You can't send to his school either. I said, why? She says, why? Because Rashi says, Vayachvosh es hachamor, right? Moshe Rabbeinu saddled the chamor, right? And Rashi says, Zeh chamor that Avram Avinu rode on, and this is the chamor that Moshe Rabbeinu took to Egypt. And it's going to be Ani V'rochav al Chamar is going to be a Chamar that Mashiach. So I said, do you understand that this Chamar is 3,500 years old? And it's still going, right? Because he's not here yet. The Chamar is 3,500. Now, Chamar may live a long time, but 3,500 years sounds a little bit strange. So she said, I believe it's Kipshuto. That God makes a miracle, right? God makes a miracle and it lasts. So I said, so you disagree with the Maralmi Prague? Because he writes on that Rashi, of course he doesn't mean literally that they rode on the same chamor. He means that every time there was a historical event that was unprecedented, you needed the tzura to ride on the chomer. That's what he says. The Avram was the tzura, Moshe was the tzura, Mashiach will be the tzura, riding on the chomer. That's what it means. I'm not going to go more than that into the moral, but that's what I told her. And then she was quiet, but never sent me a student again. So it didn't help, right? So this is something that I realized that in the yeshiva world, it's not so pushy to say, these ideas. But she probably
didn't hope for the Maharal either.
What?
She probably didn't hope for the Maharal either.
Yeah, I hear that, but it's a little bit of a chiddush, no? The Maharal.
So why didn't you should have brought her the Rambam? It would have been more difficult to be cholik on the Rambam.
Right. The Rambam also says it. It's true, but I thought on the spot of the Maharal. She had me on the spot because I didn't know we're going to have this discussion. Anyway, but the point over here is that you have to believe in Chazal, but it doesn't have to be kipshuto. Chazal could be telling me an allegory. It doesn't have. The question is whether historically it has to be true, right? So what I'm saying is, I'm not sure. Reb Yaakov, I never spoke to Reb Yaakov about that, but I know Reb Yaakov held that there's a difference between pshat and drash. That's for sure. Reb Yaakov held that's a pasha pshat, and anything you could answer according to drash, you could also answer according to pshat, and vice versa, right? So that's where we'll go to. We'll go to the next piece, which is last week, page 4. I gave you. I started off with the psukim in Tanach. Okay, Reb Yaakov he doesn't go out on a limb really, but he wants to say something al pi pshat that Chazal say al pi drash. There's a few places where Reb Yaakov likes to do this, and I'll explain to you why he likes to do it. Okay, one of the places is over here on page 4. I underlined a number of Eliyahus. Do you see that? Like the first one, Umalach Hashem Diber el Eliyah, and in pasuk Hey, Vayelech Eliyah, and pasuk Tes, Vayomar Eliyah. In pasuk Yud, it says Vayana Eliyahu, right? And then again in pasuk Yud Beit, it says Vayan Eliyah, right? So the famous Chazal in Vayikra, right, where it says in the Tochacha that HaKadosh Baruch Hu lo rak Yaakov, lo Yitzchak, Avraham, right, that God is not going to leave us, right? But Yaakov over there says with an extra vav. Yaakov is normally written Yud Ayin Kuf Bet. There it's Yud Ayin Kuf Vav Bet. So Rashi comments over there, brings a Chazal, and he says that 5 times in the Torah, not in Torah, in Tanach, it says Yaakov with a vav, and 5 times it says Eliyahu without a vav. And the Chazal say because Yaakov took Eliyahu's vav as a mashkin, right? As an orev that he would come back and announce the Gula. That's what Chazal say, right? 5 places Eliyahu without a vav, 5 places Yaakov with a Vav. Yaakov Avinu, right? Who's the last of the Avot, right? The Maharal has an old explanation there. Last of the Avot took Eliyahu's Vav in order to make sure he comes back. Okay. The 5th place, as you all know, is Hinei Anochi Sholech Lachem Et Eliyah HaNavi. Not Eliyahu HaNavi. The last psukim in Nevi'im, right? In Malachi. Hinei Anochi Sholech Et Eliyah HaNavi. So it's 4 places here and 1 place there. Okay? Those are the 5 places. Now, it's nice that it's in that 5th place because that's when Eliyahu comes back. And he comes back without a Vav, because Yaakov took that Vav, okay? But the whole idea of the Medrash seems a little bit, that Yaakov stole his Vav is a little bit interesting, right? So to say that's Kipshute, probably not, but there's an explanation there, which the Maharal, if I'm not mistaken, does talk about it. Now, this is Reb Yaakov's comment on this Medrash. Now, it's on the next page. That's page 5, or page Kuf Ayin Aleph, okay? Vayane Eliyahu Vayedaber. That's where Reb Yaakov talks on Pasuk Yud, where it does actually say Eliyahu. Hine betchilas hasefer koro b'shem Eliyah below vav. Now, when he says betchilas hasefer, it means Malachim Bet. This is the beginning of Malachim Bet. But Reb Yaakov didn't hold from Malachim Bet. But in order to give you a Maramakam, he says from the beginning of Malachim Bet, right? They call him Eliyah below Vav. V'chein Targum Yonatan. And Targum Yonatan also. V'kad Kosev B'vav. And here, it does say with a Vav, in Pasuk Yud, V'yonatan Targum below Vav. But Yonasan has it without a Vav on this one. Right? We have 4 without Vavs, but on Pasuk Yud, it's with a Vav. But the Targum has it without a Vav. Ubepasuk Yud Bet, he knows Shuv Chaser Vav, right? V'tzorachin. In Pasuk Yud Bet, it's again missing a Vav, and it's Tzorachin on the Targum. V'hinei im nemar dekan be'emes kosev below Vav. If you're going to say over here in Pasuk Yud, it's written without a Vav like the Targum. Im kain tikshi dekan nimsar b'Pasuk Gimel. Hey, if this is so, you have a question. The kan nimsar, the word nimsar is the lashon Masorah. The Masorah in Pasuk Gimel says the letter hey, which always means in the Masorah 5 times. V'hainu shehei pamim kosev Eliyah, right? Below Vav. V'hainu dalet pamim binyanenu upam achat b'sof Malachi hinei anochi sholech lachem et Eliyah hanavi, right? And therefore, of course, I'm saying parenthetically, when you bench, you should not be saying Harachaman, right? What does it say over there? Hu yiskar lanu es Eliyahu hanavi zachor latov. So it should not be Eliyahu hanavi. It should be Eliyah hanavi, right? Harachaman, right? Hu yakim lanu. No, yakim. What does it say over there? Harachaman hu. What?
One who yishlach lanu et Eliyah.
Yishlach lanu. Harachaman hu yishlach lanu et Eliyah hanavi, right? That's quoting the pasuk, basically. Hinei anochi sholech lechem et Eliyah. So it should be when you're saying, if you say it in your benching, you should say Eliyah hanavi, not Eliyah. By the way, I found one bencher in my whole life, 46 years ago, that has Eliyah, not Eliyahu. It was a bencher from England, from Great Britain, and it was the bencher of the what do you call the rabbinate in England? You call it the, I forget what they call it, the rabbinate in England. Everybody belongs to that rabbinate.
United Synagogue?
United Synagogue. The bencher said on it, the United Synagogue, and it says, right? It says, Arachman yishlach lanu et Eliyah hanavi, and not Eliyahu. And by the way, in the Siddur from Yitzchak Ber in the 1700s, he writes Eliyah, his benching as Eliyah. My grandfather was a big fan of the Avodas Yisrael Siddur. He used to call him Ber. His name was Rav Yitzchak Ber, but he always called him Ber in the Siddur of Ber, right? So there I checked. He has Eliyah Navi. And he says, because that's the way it says at the end of Tanach, right? So Reb Yaakov says, Reb Yaakov doesn't discuss that point, and I never heard Reb Yaakov say Eliyahu, because when he got to the Rachamans, he said it very low. So I didn't know. The whole benching he said out loud. Till Aliyah Chasreinu, he said mamish word for word out loud. When he got to Rachamans, he said low. So I never asked him, like, okay, what are you saying over there? Yishlach lanu with Eliyahu or Eliyah? Okay? I believe he must have said Eliyah, but I don't know for sure.
But he did say the Harakamans.
Did he say Rachamans? Yes, he did say Rachamans, but he said it very low, and I have a feeling when he was in a rush, he didn't say it. Right? But I remember him mumbling after Aliyah Chasreinu. But I didn't hear what he was saying. And I didn't have the guts to say, Zaidi, say it out loud. You know, why are you saying it low? I wanted to hear it, but I didn't have the guts to ask him, so I never heard it. Okay? Ukamosha Kosav Rashi, next page. Vayikra Chavav Membeis. Rashi writes, there's 5 times. That's the Masorah, and that's the Medrash, right? Ulafia Targum, Hareyeshtam Sheish Pamim. According to the Targum, there's 6 times. Because the Pasuk Yud here, the Targum, when it says Eliyahu, he writes Eliyah. So he has 6 times, not like the Medrash, not like the Masorah. Now, it's not a big kasha. The Targum was Yonasan ben Uziel. He's a Tana. He could disagree, right? But at least the Masorah should have said, Yeshom Rim Kacha, Yeshom Rim Kacha. Ulafia Targum, Reyeshto Sheish Pamim. Chamisha Shalonu, Ve'echad Shamalachi Hanau. Okay? But one of Malachi, which we just mentioned. Avul be'emes lefia Targum Harishon, Shuba Pasuk Gimel, Targum umalacha da'Hashem malel im Eliyahu. The first time that we have Eliyah, he has Eliyahu. So he has 4 and not 5, but he has different ones than we have. Okay? We have the first one as Eliyah on Pasuk Gimel, and he has Eliyahu if you look. Okay? And when we have in Pasuk Eliyahu in Pasuk Yud, that's the Pasuk Reb Yaakov was going on. The Targum has Eliyah. So he has the same, he has 4, but he has them in different order. The first one is Eliyahu, and the other 4 are Eliyah. Okay? So Reb Yaakov says it works good with the Masorah, makes Reb Yaakov very happy. Okay? And now Reb Yaakov says the following thing. V'hinei, mashadorshu chazal hu berashi hanal, aval anase al pi pshuto. This is Reb Yaakov's own writing. But I'm going to attempt to answer this Masorah according to Pshat. In other words, according to Chazal, he loses the Vav because Yaakov steals it from him or takes it from him as a mashko, right? Rabbi Yaakov says, I'm going to answer why it's missing a Vav al pi Pshat. Okay? That's what he says. Now, I want to tell you something because it's going to be too late to go into this. So I don't want to really, I don't want to start it, but next week we'll see how Rabbi Yaakov understands why Eliyahu loses a Vav al pi Pshat, not al pi Drash, which clearly Rabbi Yaakov was saying, anytime you have a Drash, you can have a Pshat too. Now, I want to give you an example that you all know about, okay? And where the author of the one who compiled the Chumash made a mistake, okay? Oh, by the way, the new edition called the Zucker edition, a great edition of Art Scroll Tanach, where they made a mistake here. The Targum has 5 in Melachim Eliyah, and the 6th one is in because where the Targum, our Targum, and I checked all the different texts of the Targum, right? There's only 4 by us, right? They have 5 Eliyahs, right? So there's a mistake there for sure. The guy who was typing it typed in the wrong thing for sure, even though the Zucker edition is supposed to be the most correct edition, and in many cases it is. But nonetheless, you see, it's not perfect. Okay. Now, you know the famous medrash that Reb Yaakov, the famous pasuk that Reb Yaakov talks about, Ish imo vav tirova shapsosai tishmoro, right? So Reb Yaakov met Yerucham Meshel, who was the head of the what do you call it in Israel, the AFL-CIO? Histadrut. He was the head of Histadrut, and he was a Knesset member. Okay, Yerucham Meshel. Rabbi Yaakov met him approximately like 45 years ago on a plane. Okay, and he saw the famous story. He saw Rabbi Yaakov's granddaughter helping Rabbi Yaakov out, and he asked Rabbi Yaakov if it's a hired hand that's helping him. No, Rabbi Yaakov said, was sitting next to him. They spoke in Yiddish, by the way. And Rabbi Yaakov said, no, it's my granddaughter. So he said to Rabbi Yaakov, right, my granddaughter, she wouldn't act to me like your granddaughter with such awe that she acts with you. My granddaughter wouldn't act. So Rabbi Yaakov took out, he always carried a Tanach in his briefcase. So he took out his Tanach without commentaries, and he showed him the pasuk, Ish imo vav tiro v'shapsosai tishmoro. And he said, do you remember this pasuk from Cheder? So he says, no, I don't remember it from Cheder, but I know what it means. So Rabbi Yaakov says it's a little bit of a problem. What does Kibbud Av V'Em have to do with Shabbos? Right? Now we know what Rashi says and the Chazal say is that if your parents ask you to be Machal Shabbos, you can't listen. Every Baal Tshuva knows that, right? Whether they like it or not, they know it, right? If your parents ask you to be Machal Shabbos, that's what he wrote, right? But the Reb Yerucham Meshel didn't know that. So Reb Yaakov told him something, the following thing. What did Reb Yaakov tell him? Reb Yaakov said to him, you know, you in Israel teach that there's such a thing as evolution. And therefore, man comes from monkey or some lower being, right? It's oversimplified. It comes from monkey, but a lower being. I'm afraid of Jonathan Sasson over here. So I want to be careful, right? And he said, come from a lower being, right? Meaning every generation, right, that precedes is more human than the last generation, right? I mean, you need obviously a lot of generations, like lahavdil, a million years, right? But every generation is more human, right? He says, well, then your grandchildren are more human than you are. And therefore, they feel you have to respect them because they're more human. But we believe that the first person that was created from God, Yitzir Kapav Shal Kadosh Baruch Hu, right? So that's the greatest human being. And the next generation is one generation away. So that generation has to respect the last generation because they're greater. Don't forget, Reb Yaakov's parenthetically sitting and thinking, because that's Reb Yaakov can't stop thinking about that. He's obsessed with it, right? So he says, that's the pshat, Ishimo Vov Tirovesh Shapsosai Tishmaru, right? Every man should fear his mother and father, but you have to guard my Shabbos, because what does Shabbos mean? That God created the world. If God created the world, he created man. If God created man, that's the greatest man. If that's the greatest man, so then you could be machabed your parents. But if you don't believe in that pasuk, then parents have to be machabed the children, right? That's what he told to Yerucham Meshel. And the way I'm saying it is the way it happened because I heard it from Reb Yaakov. You're going to read about a million different stories like that. This is what Reb Yaakov said, okay? Now, in the Sefer on Chumash, it says, when he quotes this Rashi, Reb Yaakov says, Nira Levayar Akesher ben Shnei Inyanim. Okay? And Reb Yaakov writes about it. Okay? So the fellow who did the editing here said, right? V'ayim barashi shehevi chazal mashadorshu ledina me'asmicha shel kibbud av v'em l'shmira Shabbos. Take a look in Rashi, Darshan's the smichut between kibbud av v'em and Shabbos, right? That if your parents tell you to be Machal Shabbos, you don't have to listen. V'divrei Rabbeinu nemru b'tor drush. And the words of Rabbeinu you have to say is al pi drush. Now I heard it from Reb Yaakov, and this is what Reb Yaakov said. You have to say that the Chazal are drush, but I'm going to give you the pshat. Why do you have to say Chazal are drush? Because why did you pick Shabbos? You could pick Kashrus. You could pick a million mitzvahs. Ish imavov tiro valtil bashatnis. Right? You could pick a million psukim that, if your parents ask you to wear shatnez, you don't have to listen to them. Right?
No,
Why Shabbos?
Because that's what it says in the pasuk. It's Yira and Shabbos are in the same pasuk.
Right. So Reb Yaakov says, according to Chazal, that they learn that you mean, right? If your parents tell you to be Machal Shabbos, you don't have to listen. What if your parents tell you to eat a ham sandwich? Do you have to listen?
No.
Right. You should listen. So Ishi Mavov Taro, Val Tochel Chazir. Right? You could use any pasuk. But according to Rabbi Yaakov, it's really need Shabbos. Shabbos is in what's the word? Shabbos is completely connected with Kibbut Avein, right? Intrinsically connected with Kibbut Avein. So Rabbi Yaakov said to me, I'm saying pshat, because according to the drash, you could still ask a question, right? So he says, I'm saying pshat. So you see that the author here misinterpreted it. That Rabbi Yaakov held that in every drash you could say a pshat.
Right. What you quoted, that was the editor of what? Of the Art Scroll edition?
No. It's on the bottom of Emes LeYaakov on Chumash. The editor decides to tell you that Chas v'Sholem, Rabbi Yaakov would say fakir from Chazal, right? So he must have said it al pi drash. And I remember Rabbi Yaakov saying the Chazal are drash, and you have to accept it, but there's always a pshat.
Oh, that wasn't Reb Yaakov Kamenetsky who did the editing here?
No, Chas v'Sholem. He didn't write. This was another grandson of Reb Yaakov through marriage. Actually, a very big Talmud Chacham. But unfortunately, I think he had the yeshivish attitude that you can't argue on a drash. So how did Reb Yaakov say a different pshat? And the answer is Reb Yaakov held. It's not arguing. It's a different. You have pshat and drash, and never the twain shall meet. So it doesn't have to go together. Next week we'll see how Reb Yaakov understands Eliyah al pi pshat as opposed to Eliyah al pi drash, like the Medrash drash darshan. Okay.
Okay, Yishkoyach, Toda Rabba.
Sure.
Can I ask the Rav a question before?
Sure. Go
we
ahead.
finish?
Go for it.
So the Rav was talking about how the Ramban was defending always the Goanim and the same thing in terms of the Midrashim that but don't we always we have Gaonim who are also arguing. We have Midrashim that are contradicting each other as well.
Right.
So how can one not have the Shivim Panim the Torah, where in any event we always have to juggle the fact of like what we're understanding literally versus what we're understanding more midrashically in the lesson behind something, right? Like I know it's very popular today that everyone wants to try to understand that or explain the midrashim in a very pshat way, as if everything mamish happened. But even within midrashim, there's so many stirot and like different like opinions in terms of how things ikeda amris, etc. So
again, the question is, in all these midrashim, I think it's a great question actually, but in all these midrashim, right? When you're asking me, well, there's a machlokis. When there's a machlokis, so why? So how could you tell me I have to believe the medrash? Which one do I have to believe? Right? Do I have to believe medrash X or Y? Since there's a machlokis in it, right? So of course, a lot of times Reb Yaakov is going to try to show that it's really not a machlokis. It's two ways of looking up at the same thing. I'll show you places where Reb Yaakov tries to do this. But even where you can't do it, we'll have next week, I'll show you in the piece that we're going to learn about Eliyom, that we'll see that there is a machlokis, whether Eliyom is Pinchas or not Pinchas. It's a machlokis in Medrash, simply. So your question really is, like, wait a minute, so what do I have to believe over here? I can't believe both. Either he was from Pinchas or he wasn't. Either he was a Kohen or he wasn't a Kohen. So what's going on over here? So one thing we could say is where, let's say there is a medrash that says Avram Avinu was thrown into Kivshan Ha'esh, right? In a case where there's no medrash that disagrees with that, then certainly the Ramban felt you have to accept it. Maybe where someone disagrees, you have a right to pick your medrash, right? By the way, Reb Yaakov held, and I don't remember anybody learning this way, that that there's psak halacha in medrash too, which medrash you have to accept and which you don't if there's a machlokes. But I don't remember ever Reb Yaakov bringing that up ever, such a thing, right? But somebody told me Reb Yaakov held like that. That's why he said that that on, I think, from Nosson Slifkin's book, right? He brings Gaonim to show some of his ideas being true, and Reb Yaakov said we don't paskin like those Gaonim, right? So he says that, but I don't remember ever hearing that before Reb Yaakov, right? I remember that if there's no machlokus in the medrash accepted, even though you don't have to accept the kipshuto. That's the way I understand. And I think the Maharal also understood it that way. But where there's a machlokes, right? There already you have to ask different people, because I know that Reb Yaakov tried to show that there's a connection between the two ideas in the medrash, even though they're disagreeing. There's a connection between the two ideas in the medrash, right? Just like Elu Ve'elu Divrei Kimchayim on halacha, meaning the Gemara has a machlokas, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva, and we say Elu Ve'elu Divrei Kimchayim, and we could show that they're both true, right? They both could really be true subjectively, right? So too in medrash, they both have to be true, right? So if they're saying something, one is saying like he's a Kohen, and the other one is saying he's not a Kohen, that's a Metzius already. So that's already more of a problem. So how do you connect the two medrashim? So that's where your question will be. So I'll talk a little bit more about it next week when we see this idea is Elio Pinchas or not Pinchas.
Right. But if we take it, we don't take the belief anymore as being pshat, but rather a belief in the idea. So then one can always change the idea that one's learning out of the midrash, and it makes it completely fungible. More so in terms of like when we say we believe in the midrash, well, if we're only believing in the idea or the lesson behind the midrash.
Correct.
So then it becomes much more subjective or fungible.
Well, yeah, because let's say you have two ideas being brought out in the medrash, you can believe both, even though they're disagreeing. They both can be true, as far as our Torah is concerned. Just like two halachas can be true, right? Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel could be true, even though you have to paskin one way. So I don't think Reb Yaakov held in a medrash you have to paskin a way. But they told me Reb Yaakov did hold like that. There's psak halacha medrash too, but I never heard that before, Reb Yaakov. Okay, we'll talk about it more next week. Take care, guys.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.